Welcome to the graveyard. I'm Violet Hummingbird, and this is day 3 of Spooky October. Every evening in the month of October, I will be reading you a true spooky story, and today's story is by Margaret. Now, I actually haven't read these stories beforehand. I've just skimmed them to pick them out, and so we will be experiencing it together for the first time. So let's begin. The communion vessels clinked as my husband Michael prepared the bread and wine for the Wednesday morning communion service. It was held in the small lady chapel of his West Yorkshire church in the north of England. I looked up to see if he'd spilt the wine. Normally, one of the parishioners laundered the altar linen, but if he was responsible for the spillage, the job would come to me. Other members of the small congregation had looked up too, but all was well. I closed my eyes for the prayer of consecration, a luxury afforded to me only on Wednesdays. On Sunday mornings, the children would be with me in the pew, and I couldn't risk closing my eyes for more than 20 seconds at a time. Vicarage children had to be seen to behave in church. Mrs. Shaw was at the service. She was a homely-looking woman in her late 60s or early 70s and had recently moved to the parish to live in an upstairs flat of a large house very close to the church. It was built of the same millstone grit which had once been a pleasing gray, but had been darkened by the ravages of smoke from the mill chimneys. By the 1970s, there were scarcely any mills in the town, which was now a smokeless zone. The area to the west on the edge of the Pennine Hills was the most salubrious and pleasant part of the town. The church, the vicarage, and Mrs. Shaw's flat looked out over 70 acres of open parkland, a favorite place for dog walkers, cross-country runners, and model airplane enthusiasts. At the weekend, it was a mecca for football and rugby teams. From the church, the road climbed gently uphill to the grammar school, which had once been an orphanage, built, of course, in the same small millstone grit, but in an ornate French style. The houses by the side of the park were opulent Victorian dwellings. Behind them ran smaller terraces, crisscrossed by an even smaller ones of more modest means. The congregation, like the houses, was an affable mix. On this particular Wednesday, in April 1979, Mrs. Shaw invited a few of the parishioners to her conveniently placed flat for a cup of coffee after the service. My husband had shaken hands with her as she left the church, and I overheard her asking him, "Who's the gentleman helping you at the altar today?" Adding, "I didn't notice him until I looked up when you clinked the chalice." When Michael told her nobody had helped him, he had a server only on Sundays, she looked at him in a curious way. "Well, he was by your side," she said. "He was trying to tell you something." Michael tried to assure her again that he had been alone in the sanctuary, and he left her to enjoy a cup of coffee with her friends and hopefully clear her mind. So convinced was Mrs. Shaw that she had seen someone that she described him in detail to a long-standing member of the congregation, who immediately recognized him as being a former church warden who had been held in great esteem in the parish, but who was now dead. Frank had been a server at the altar, and he had lived in one of the smaller houses behind the large ones on the edge of the park. Mrs. Shaw hadn't been perturbed by the news that the visitor to the sanctuary was someone who'd been dead for several years. What did perturb her was that he'd been trying to communicate with the vicar, almost as if he was wanting to warn him of something. But of what? And when? And where? She laid the matter and the ghost to rest as she cleared away the coffee cups. She hadn't known the man. Nobody else had been aware of him. The vicar had denied having anyone to help him at the altar that morning, and in any case, what could be done if no one knew what the communication had intended to convey? The next morning, Michael was called out to help at a service in the neighboring parish where the vicar was ill. Our children were at school, so I went with him. On our return, as we drove down the side of the park, or the moor as it was known locally, we saw a solitary shoe in the grass surrounded by a blue cordon and an alarming number of policemen. By noon, it was common knowledge in the area that there had been a murder. A young girl of 19 had been killed, most brutally in the early hours of the morning as she had walked home from her grandmother's house. The 1 o'clock news revealed her name. She was a girl from our parish and had lived in one of the small terraced houses near the moor. She was the 11th victim of the so-called Yorkshire Ripper. The following morning, I met one of the ladies who'd been at Mrs. Shaw's coffee party. Until then, I had no idea of the identity of the mysterious visitor at the altar. He had died long before we arrived at the parish, but this lady sincerely believed it had been Frank. And now she knew why he'd come and what his warning was. I was intrigued, but more than a little cynical. But this lady was like a dog with a bone and would not rest until she'd regaled me with Frank's life story, whom he had married and where he had lived. Back at the vicarage, Michael was preparing to visit the murdered girl's bereaved parents and brother who'd once been in the church choir. "Where do they live?" I asked. The answer, like a thunderbolt, laid flat my cynicism. It was the house where Frank had lived. So let me know in the comments below how you enjoyed that story. And if you have any spooky stories of your own that are true, please email them to me if you want me to read them at heytherehummingbird@runbox.com. And otherwise, I will see you tomorrow for another spooky story. And happy spooky October.